Imagine you're an editor at a major publisher. You've commissioned a book by a well-known politician who's getting a lot of media time at the moment. When the first chapters come in, you are delighted. It's the most lucid, best written and persuasive book you've read by any politician of any persuasion. You throw a party to celebrate the book, inviting booksellers and your friends from across the industry. Everyone is excited for this book. And then word comes down from your boss's boss's boss, from the owner of your company, saying that the book is no good and your publisher will not be publishing it. Not only that, but they want you to publicly agree that the book is no good to hide any other potential motives for your publisher pulling out of publishing it. What would you do? This was a situation faced by an editor called Stuart Proffitt in 1998, who at the time was working for HarperCollins, a subsidiary of News Corp owned by Rupert Murdoch. I'll let you know what he did in this situation later in the video. First though, a bit of context. Hong Kong was a British colony between the 1840s and 1997. In 1898, Britain signed a 100-year lease on part of the territory of Hong Kong, and in 1984 it was agreed that at the expiry of this lease, the whole territory of Hong Kong would be restored to Chinese control, albeit with a provision that the social and economic system would remain unchanged in Hong Kong for 50 years after the handover. As a British colony, Hong Kong was ruled by a governor selected by the British government. For most of that time, there was little or no democracy in the governance of Hong Kong. However, after the 1984 agreement to hand over Hong Kong back to Chinese control 13 years later, the British government started introducing some elements of representational democracy into the system of Hong Kong. The last British governor of Hong Kong was a man named Chris Patten. He had been a member of the British Parliament for the Conservative Party between 1979 and 1992, becoming quite senior in the government, acting as a cabinet minister under both Margaret Thatcher and John Major's governments. He lost his seat in the 1992 general election, however, after which he was appointed governor of Hong Kong. And once installed, he started to accelerate the democratic changes that were happening in the colony in the years leading up to the handover. Now, if you ask me, democratisation is generally a good thing. People should have a say in who gets to make the decisions that affect their lives. But was that why the British government was making these reforms? Or was it more about putting more power in the hands of the people of Hong Kong so that there would be less power in the hands of the Chinese government after the handover? The Chinese government certainly seems to have seen it that way, and they frequently butted heads with Chris Patten and were not big fans of his. As his governorship came to an end, Patten decided to write a book. And the handover of Hong Kong was obviously huge news. There was a lot of interest in it at the time, a lot of interest in the years leading up to the handover. So by writing a book, Patten saw an opportunity to get his experience and his perspective across and make quite a bit of money in the process. The book was picked up by HarperCollins, and Chris Patten set to work writing the book under the guidance of his editor, Stuart Proffitt. You know what happened next. The word came down from above that the book was no good and needed to be scrapped. But why would they cancel a book when all evidence suggested it was going to be quite a hot seller? It now seems clear that the real reason came down to Rupert Murdoch's attempts to expand his media empire into China. Bruce Dover, who's been described as Murdoch's man on the ground in China during the 1990s, has written a book called Rupert's Adventures in China about Murdoch's attempts to grow his business in the country. Murdoch owned Sky, the British satellite TV corporation, and in 1993 he bought Star TV, hoping to make it the dominant satellite TV provider across Asia and particularly in China. His efforts to grow Star TV in China were hindered by the Chinese government, and Murdoch felt that the best way forward was to try and gain favour with powerful members of the government. In a previous video, I've mentioned how during this period, HarperCollins, at great expense, published and heavily promoted a book by Deng Rong, the daughter of Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader of China during this period. It seems likely that Murdoch felt that publishing a book by Chris Patten, notoriously unpopular with the Chinese government, writing about his experiences and defending his actions as the governor in Hong Kong, wouldn't improve Murdoch's status in Beijing. Higher-ups at HarperCollins took the Murdoch line that the book was simply no good and couldn't be published. They pressured Stuart Prophet to join in with this lie. He refused. He stuck to his guns and was pushed out of the company, with the book being dropped. Months later, under the threat of court action, Murdoch issued an apology and a payout to Prophet, who went on to have a very successful editorial career with Penguin, where he remains to this day. Patten's book, titled East and West, was picked up and published by Macmillan in the UK and Crown in the US, where it was sold proudly displaying like a badge of honour a sticker reading "The book that Rupert Murdoch refused to publish." The story also got a lot of attention in the press in the UK, a big chunk of which is owned by Murdoch and the rest of which is owned by Murdoch's rivals. In testimony given during the Leveson inquiry in 2012, Patten described all this extra attention as being worth tens of thousands on the sale of the book.
I mean, it was a commercial decision, I don't think, which rebounded to my financial advantage.
What are the implications of this story? Does this reveal something wrong with the situation at HarperCollins, or even with the publishing industry as a whole? Instinctively, this feels like a bad thing to me. Rupert Murdoch, owner of the company but not directly involved in the day-to-day editorial processes and decisions, cancelling a book for essentially his own personal interests and reasons, which were political reasons that I wouldn't necessarily agree with. And yet, I don't think the head of a publishing house should be forced to publish a book that they disagree with. Much like Hong Kong under both British and Chinese rule, a publishing house is not a democracy. I probably wouldn't want my publisher to publish a book by Chris Patten either, although that's more because he was part of governments which sowed the seeds for decades of poverty in parts of the UK and then went on to be a colonial governor. HarperCollins dropping the book didn't stop it from being published and going on to sell well. Surely freedom of the press includes Murdoch being able to choose not to publish the book, as well as Macmillan deciding to publish it. Maybe more democracy within publishing houses would improve the situation, having a process where a majority of staff could veto a book and get it cancelled from publication, but one individual member of staff couldn't make that decision against the wishes of everybody else. How practical that would be, I don't know, and I don't really see Rupert Murdoch starting to experiment with systems like that at his companies anyway. Perhaps the issue is that in this case the person making the decisions wasn't a publisher or an editor at the company, they were just an owner making the decision in their own interests rather than in the interest of anybody else at the company. A model of worker ownership or increased worker control might have helped prevent a situation like this. Maybe the problem is he was trying to appeal to the Chinese government, which was behind the Tiananmen Square massacre less than a decade earlier. A lot of companies make changes to try and appease the harmful norms of oppressive governments, and I certainly think it's fair to criticise that. On the other hand, this is a reversal of the usual situation of government leaders trying to gain Murdoch's favour, which is possibly even worse. We discussed the story of this book in a lecture as part of my Masters in Publishing that I'm doing at the moment. We took a bit of a straw poll to see what would people do. Would they have stuck to their guns like Stuart Prophet did and make potentially a huge personal sacrifice and lose everything? Or would they have quietly dropped the book and kept their job? I was quite surprised and disappointed when someone in the room said that they would have anticipated the problem and not commissioned the book in the first place. I feel that if you wanted to get ahead of the problem, and this is a suggestion that nobody made, I might not have taken the job at a publishing house owned by Rupert Murdoch in the first place. Murdoch is known for his political inclinations, his business methods, and the lack of editorial freedom at his publications, all of which would make me reluctant to take a job where I was trying to make him a profit, and I knew that something like this might happen. That said, there are not a lot of good jobs going in publishing, especially not at companies which aren't owned by the mega rich or massive corporations. In fact, in any sector, it's quite unlikely you'll find a job at a company that you're fully on board with ethically. I've been there myself. I've been in jobs that paid well, but where I felt morally conflicted about what the company did. I've also been in jobs where I enjoyed the work, I didn't feel bad about what the company was doing, but I knew that the owner of the company had supported some pretty nasty political groups. In a capitalist society, we are always effectively coerced into putting the need to make money ahead of our own personal ethics and morals, unless we get particularly lucky. The situation might be improved if the publishing industry were less concentrated in the offices of a handful of massive corporations. I've talked before about the importance of a variety of approaches to publishing. If there were more smaller publishers, there would be a greater opportunity for an editor to find a job at a publishing house where the values match their own more closely. Not to mention, a smaller company is less likely to be owned by a horrendous billionaire like Rupert Murdoch. And HarperCollins isn't the only publisher with some questionable stablemates. In a previous video, I've quoted Andre Schiffrin talking about how the owners of Hachette, one of the other major publishing companies, has significant stakes in the arms industry. How might that influence what they publish? Ultimately, I feel this story is a useful reminder about the nature of corporate publishing. We shouldn't ignore who owns a publisher when applying for a job, submitting a manuscript, or buying a book and deciding whether to trust it. Personally, I'd like to see a move towards more publishing houses being owned and run by the people who actually work there. What do you think of this situation? What would you have done? If you're unhappy about what happened, why is that? And what do you think could be done to prevent this sort of thing happening more in the future? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.